In the fall of 1945, in a poor neighborhood of Memphis, Tennessee, a young mother answered a knock at her door. The woman standing on the step wore good clothes and spoke with the easy authority of an official. She said she was a social worker. She had heard there was a sick baby in the house, and she could arrange a hospital bed at no cost. The mother had a 10-month-old daughter named Irma. A fever had been running through the child for days, and there was no money for a doctor. So she said yes. That afternoon, her daughter was carried out to a long black car, wrapped in a blanket, and driven away to receive the care her mother could not afford. When the mother came to the hospital to visit, she was turned away at the desk. When she came back again, she was told the thing no parent survives in one piece. The baby had died. There was no funeral she was invited to. There was no grave she was ever shown. There was no death certificate she was ever handed. She was a poor single woman in Memphis in 1945. The person who told her that her child was dead held a position of public trust, so she believed it, because there was nothing else she could do. 44 years later, the telephone rang in her home. The call was about Irma. Here is the arithmetic that sits underneath that phone call. In those years, the state of Tennessee allowed a licensed agency to charge $7 for handling an adoption. $7, at a time when a working man might earn that in a day or two. Yet couples in New York and Los Angeles were paying as much as $5,000 for a single infant from one particular agency in Memphis. $5,000 was the price of a house. The gap between those two numbers, between $7 and $5,000, was not a rounding error. It was a business. It ran for 26 years inside a public charity, under a state charter, beside a juvenile court, and it moved, by the estimate history has settled on, 5,000 children. The woman who ran it was celebrated for most of her life. A president-elect invited her to his inauguration. The First Lady of the United States asked for her advice on the welfare of children. Newspapers called her a national authority on adoption. And when the state of Tennessee finally opened an investigation into what she had actually built, the inquiry was 4 days old when she died in her bed, uncharged, unquestioned, and unpunished. Then the state sealed the records. They stayed sealed for 44 years. This film follows what those records show. Not the legend, and not the novel that later sold 4 million copies, but the documented trail. A knock at a door, a $7 fee, a long black car, and a mother who waited half a lifetime to learn what one phone call could finally tell her. If documented history like this matters to Dark-Historium viewers, subscribing is the one way to help. A word on the sources beneath this film, spoken once so the viewer can weigh everything else. The spine is the state's own paper. The 1950 investigation and the 1951 findings read alongside the contemporary Memphis press. The flesh is the scholarship and reporting built after 1995 from the opened files, above all the years of archival research that produce the fullest modern accounting of the case. Beside it stands the recorded testimony of survivors and mothers, given to newspapers, television, and researchers across 4 decades. Where those layers agree, this film speaks plainly. Where they diverge, or where a number is a projection, the narration has said so, and will keep saying so. Nothing in what follows rests on rumor, and nothing needed to. Beulah Georgia Tann was born on July 18, 1891, in Mississippi, the daughter of a judge. Her father, George Clark Tann, presided over a chancery court, and in the small towns where the family lived, his word carried the weight of law. People who knew the household described him as commanding and exact. His daughter grew up watching what a courtroom could do to a family. A chancery judge in Mississippi in those years handled the wreckage of ordinary life. Debts, contested wills, broken guardianships, and the question of what happened to children when their parents could not keep them. That last category mattered. In the early 1900s, there was no real system for such children in most of the South. There were orphanages, some clean and some wretched. There were relatives, when relatives could afford another mouth. And there were courts, which could move a child from one life to another with a signature. Georgia Tann saw that machinery early, and she saw it from the bench side, where it looked orderly and wise. Her father had plans for her that had nothing to do with any of it. She was trained at the piano for years, pointed toward the concert stage, toward a respectable marriage, toward the ornamental life a Southern judge expected for a daughter. She went along with the lessons and then set the whole plan down. What drew her instead was the new field then calling itself child saving. Social work barely existed as a profession. There were no licensing boards worth the name, no standard training, and almost no oversight. A determined woman, with good manners, and a judge for a father, could go far in it. She did. By the early 1920s, she was working for the Mississippi Children's Home Society, and she rose quickly to run its receiving home in Jackson, the front door through which children entered the system. The receiving director decided which children came in, and where they went, and how much anyone ever heard about it afterward. It was a great deal of quiet power for a young woman, and the record shows how she used it. In 1924, the society terminated her. The stated reason, preserved in the polite language of the time, was questionable child-placing methods. Behind that phrase sat complaints that would become familiar in Memphis years later. Children taken from poor families on thin grounds. Placements arranged fast and far away. Paperwork that did not quite hold together when anyone pulled on it. What followed is the first quiet turning point in this story, and it is worth sitting with. Nothing followed. She was not charged with anything. She was not reported to any authority, because there was no authority built to receive such a report. No warning followed her across a state line. No registry recorded why she had been let go. A woman dismissed for questionable methods in the placing of children simply packed her house and gathered her companion Ann Atwood and the children in their care. She drove north to a bigger city, a bigger charity, and a court that would come to trust her completely. The city was Memphis. The charity was called the Tennessee Children's Home Society. It had been chartered in 1897 as a respectable statewide institution, and its Memphis branch needed an energetic new executive. In 1924, it hired one. She would hold that office for 26 years, and in all that time, no one who mattered in Memphis ever pulled on the paperwork again. The Mississippi years deserve more than a paragraph, because everything Memphis later saw at industrial scale exists in them at workshop scale, documented well enough after the records opened for the pattern to be beyond argument. The receiving home she ran in Jackson carried the name of a benefactor, the Kate McWillie Powers Receiving Home for Children, and it functioned as the state society's intake valve. Children arrived there from courts, from churches, from desperate parents, and from the field work of its receiving director. And the receiving director had learned early that the field was where the discretion lived. Accounts assembled by later researchers describe her father's chancery court as part of her working world. A chancery judge in Mississippi held jurisdiction over dependent children, and a judge's daughter running a receiving home made for short paperwork. Children of families deemed unfit, in an era when unfit could mean poor, unmarried, or merely unlucky, moved from the court's custody to the home's custody, along a path with no independent eyes on it anywhere. The complaints that got her terminated in 1924 were of a piece: placements made against the wishes of living parents. Children moved out of reach before objections could form, an early and telling preference for placing children far away, where Mississippi's courts and Mississippi's gossip could not follow. One case from those years, cited in later accounts, involved children taken from a mother whose principal documented failing was poverty, and placed over the protest of relatives who wanted them. The Society's board, reviewing such cases, chose the word questionable and chose severance over scandal, and the choice tells us what boards of that era were built to protect: the institution's name, not the children in its files. There is one more Mississippi detail worth carrying to Memphis, because survivors and researchers alike return to it. She was, by every account, tireless. She worked nights, drove bad roads, kept files in her head, remembered names and faces for decades, and never in 26 years took the kind of extended rest that might have let a deputy see the whole ledger. Historians of fraud recognize the trait. The indispensable executive, the one who never delegates the books, is a figure auditors are now trained to treat as a warning sign. The Mississippi Society experienced the trait as dedication. Memphis would experience it the same way, for far longer, at a price no one has ever finished counting. The failure that let her cross that state line was not dramatic. It was ordinary. A board wanted a quiet dismissal instead of a scandal. A profession had no way to track its own. A state had no reason to ask questions about a woman with good references and a dead file. Every institution behaved normally. That is precisely what makes the next 26 years so hard to look at, because the machine she built in Memphis was not hidden in a basement. It was assembled in public, piece by piece, out of institutions, working exactly the way institutions work. To understand how 5,000 children could pass through one office in one city, the first thing to understand is that almost nobody was looking. The second thing to understand is who was. Memphis, in 1924, was a city run on cotton, river trade, and one man's political machine. It was also, for a poor woman with children, one of the hardest places in America to ask for help. There was no federal safety net. Aid for a mother alone came from churches, from charity boards, and from the mercy of officials who decided, case by case, who deserved it. Every one of those doors could be watched. The new executive of the Tennessee Children's Home Society understood that better than anyone alive. Her method worked like a net laid across the city's poorest streets. Case files and testimony later let it be reconstructed. She cultivated informants where desperate mothers appeared, nurses in maternity wards, clerks who handled relief applications, boarding housekeepers who knew which tenant was expecting and unmarried. Word came back to the office on Poplar Avenue, and then the woman herself, or one of her workers, went out in the long black car. Sometimes the approach was an offer: free medical care for a sick child, a temporary place for the children to stay while a mother got back on her feet after an eviction or a birth. Temporary was the working word. Mothers signed papers they could not always read. The papers were described as consent for boarding or for treatment. They learned later what the papers actually said. Sometimes there was no offer at all. Children were taken from front porches and schoolyards on the strength of a report that the home was unfit. The parents were left to argue with an office that had the law's full attention. They had none of it. One statement recurs through the later files, with the flat sameness of a stamp. The child is doing well and cannot be returned. Then silence. A mother who kept pressing might be told her child had been placed with people of means, people who could give advantages. What kind of love, she would be asked, would stand in the way of that? A mother who still kept pressing could find her own fitness under review by a court that had already decided who deserved children and who did not. The word unfit did tremendous work in those files. It was a legal finding, and it attached to poverty the way rust attaches to iron. A mother who took in washing and left her children with a neighbor was unfit by reason of neglect. A mother with no husband was unfit by reason of morals. A father laid off from the mill was unfit by reason of circumstances. The finding could be produced quickly, on thin evidence, because the judge who signed such findings in Shelby County trusted the woman who requested them. That judge will enter this story properly in a little while, and the trust between the two of them is the hinge on which everything else turns. What the mothers could not see was where the children went. Some went no farther than a boarding home across town, waiting. But the profitable ones, the healthy white infants with blonde hair and blue eyes, were photographed, described in warm catalog prose, and matched to waiting couples 1,000 miles away. Escorts carried babies on overnight trains, and later on airplanes to New York and California. The paperwork traveled separately, and it changed as it went. Names changed. Birth dates shifted. Histories were invented to order. A child could leave Memphis as one person and arrive in Los Angeles as another. Her fresh birth certificate named the buyers as the parents who had born her. That single administrative trick, the amended birth certificate, was the load-bearing wall of the whole structure. It was sold to legislatures as a mercy, a way to spare adopted children the stigma of illegitimacy. In Memphis, it functioned as something else. It erased the trail. A mother searching for her daughter was searching for a name that no longer existed. The name was held by a family she had never heard of, in a state she had never visited, and behind it stood a document saying, under official seal, that her child had been born to someone else. It is worth slowing down over the mechanics of a single taking, because the phrase, her methods, can hide more than it shows, and the record after 1995 allows the sequence to be reconstructed. The pattern repeats across the files, with small variations, and the pattern, not any single monstrous act, is the crime. It begins with information. A ward nurse mentions an unmarried patient in the maternity ward. A relief clerk flags a family applying for aid with 5 children and no father in the house. A neighbor writes a letter describing a woman of low character raising a pretty daughter. None of these informants thinks of themselves as part of anything. They are helping a famous charity, or so they think. It continues with a visit. Sometimes the visitor offers services, boarding for the children during a hard month, medical care for a sick baby, and a paper is produced. The paper is described as consent for temporary care. The mother often reads poorly. She trusts officials. She signs. In the files, that signature will later be treated as a surrender of the child. Sometimes there is no paper and no offer, only a report to the juvenile court that the home is unfit, followed by a custody order, followed by workers arriving with the order in hand and the law behind them. A mother who resists an order of the Shelby County Juvenile Court in 1935 is not resisting a social worker. She is resisting the police power of the state of Tennessee. It continues with distance. The child is moved immediately, first to a boarding home across town, then often out of the city entirely. Visits are refused. delayed, or permitted once, never again. Letters go unanswered. A mother is told the child has been placed and is thriving, and that further contact would be disruptive to the child's adjustment. The vocabulary is always therapeutic. What it protects is the operation, and it ends with paper again. In due course, a petition is granted. An adoption is finalized in some distant county or distant state, and a new birth certificate is issued, naming new parents, sometimes a new birthplace, always a new name. The original certificate is sealed. From that day, the child exists twice, once as a sealed fact, and once as a public fiction, and every institution the mother could ever appeal to will consult the fiction. Multiply that sequence by year after year, and neighborhood after neighborhood, and one more feature of the files comes into focus, the one survivors speak of most bitterly. Brothers and sisters were separated almost as a matter of routine. Sibling groups were harder to place and fetched no premium, so the files show them divided between states the way lots are divided at auction, each child renamed, none told where the others went. Some of those separations outlasted the operation, the seal, the reforms, and the century. Some of them are still being repaired now, one mail-order genetics kit at a time, by grandchildren. One more feature of the Memphis market must be stated plainly, because the files state it plainly, and looking away would falsify the story. The trade ran on white infants, the catalog prose, the hair and eye specifications in the applicant's letters, the premium prices. All of it belonged to a market whose buyers were prosperous white couples shopping, in the idiom of the age, for children who could pass as their own. Black families in Memphis lived under the same poverty, and worse, but their children were not what the market ordered, and so the operation largely passed them by. It is a bitter accounting. In segregated Memphis, exclusion from a child-selling enterprise was one of the only protections poverty ever afforded anyone, and it was not mercy. It was demand. The operation's racial boundary is one more proof, if more were needed, of what the enterprise actually was. Not a warped charity, a retailer obeying its customers. The geography of the supply side was just as legible. The society's net lay over particular streets, the river wards, the mill districts, the boarding house blocks where rents were weekly and fathers were scarce. Respectable Memphis did not lose children to the long black car, and this was not caution. It was the business model. A machine that took a banker's daughter would have lasted a week. A machine that took a laundress's daughter lasted 26 years, because the difference between those two families was the difference between people whose complaints entered the record and people whose complaints entered a wastebasket. Every durable predator of institutional history has understood this arithmetic. The office on Poplar Avenue merely practiced it with unusual discipline in a city whose political order was purpose-built to keep the two Memphises from ever having to hear each other. The scale of it grew through the 20s and 30s, and the city noticed almost nothing. What the city saw instead was a stout, gray-haired woman in rimless glasses. She gave interviews about the plight of unwanted children. She was thanked in church bulletins, and she moved through Memphis in a chauffeured car the way important people did. Children entered her receiving home at a steady pace. Trains left on schedule, and in a 14 by 13-foot burial lot across town, which the society had quietly purchased, a first small grave had already been dug as early as September of 1923. That lot will return in this story too. It kept its own kind of ledger. To understand what Memphis was buying and selling, it helps to stand back and look at what America believed about children in those years. Because Georgia Tann did not invent her market. She inherited its raw conditions and then organized them the way a gifted industrialist organizes any scattered trade. At the turn of the century, the country's answer to the poor child had been the orphanage and the orphan train. For decades, Eastern charities had loaded city children onto westbound trains and distributed them to farm families at station stops, a practice defended as rescue and remembered with a shudder. By the 1920s, the trains were ending, and the institutions were under attack from a new profession of social workers who argued that children belonged in families, not wards. The argument was winning. What the argument had not yet produced was any regulated way to move a child from a family that could not keep her to a family that wanted her. Into that gap came private agencies, church homes, maternity boarding houses, and freelance baby farmers, operating under a patchwork of state laws written for a different century. At the same time, respectable science was arguing about what a poor child was worth, and the argument was uglier than most Americans now remember. The eugenics movement stood at high tide. Serious people in serious institutions taught that criminality, feeble-mindedness, and pauperism ran in the blood. The children of the poor, the doctrine held, carried their parents' defects the way they carried their eyes. Under that doctrine, adoption was a fool's gamble. A childless banker who took in a laundress's daughter was importing degenerate stock into his line. Adoption rates among the prosperous stayed low accordingly. The counter-doctrine, the one Georgia Tann preached from Memphis, held that environment was destiny and heredity was superstition. It is one of history's sourer jokes that the person who did the most practical damage to American mothers stood, in the intellectual battle of her era, on what became the winning and broadly humane side. She told wealthy couples the gamble was safe, and they believed her, and demand rose. She was not the only voice making that case, but she made it with inventory on hand. Then the demand curve bent upward twice more. The Depression stripped hundreds of thousands of families of the ability to feed their children. The supply side flooded with exactly the desperate mothers her methods required. And the war and post-war years produced a national hunger for family on a scale never measured before. By the middle 1940s, waiting lists for healthy infants at legitimate agencies ran to years. Money was ready, regulation was not. Tennessee's $7 fee cap and its counterparts in other states guarded the front door of American adoption, while the side doors stood open to anyone with nerve, letterhead, and a cooperative judge. That is the national machine into which one fired receiving director stepped in 1924. Nothing about the era excuses what the file shows. But the era explains the market's existence, and it explains something else this story needs. It explains the buyers. The couples writing to Memphis from Park Avenue and Beverly Hills were not, in the main, knowing participants in a crime. The science of their own childhood had told them not to adopt. Now a national authority said it was finally safe. At the exact moment the culture told them family was everything. The office on Poplar Avenue sat at the meeting point of all of it, taking $7 on the books, and whatever the traffic would bear off them. 2 roads out of Memphis carried the same cargo and never crossed. On one, a Pullman berth or an airline seat, a paid nurse, a labeled basket, and a child traveling toward a name she did not have yet. On the other, a streetcar fare home from the courthouse for a woman carrying a purse full of papers that had just defeated her. The files preserve both roads in detail. What they preserve most exactly is that the roads were engineered never to meet again, and for most of a century, they did not. Every operation like this one needs a public face, and hers was superb. By the middle of the 1930s, Georgia Tann was not merely respectable. She was admired, cited, and consulted, and the distance between her reputation and her files is one of the most instructive gaps in American institutional history. The reputation was built on a real idea. That is what made it work. When she began, much respectable opinion held that illegitimate children carried bad blood, that adoption was a gamble against heredity, and that the poor bred the unfit. She preached the opposite: environment over heredity. Any child, placed young enough in a good home, could become anything. It was, on its face, a humane and modern doctrine, and she pressed it in speeches, in interviews, and in a newspaper column's worth of warm publicity that flowed out of Memphis for years. Demand for adoptable infants rose nationally through the 30s and 40s, and she positioned herself as the woman who could meet it. The honors followed. She addressed national conferences on child welfare. Eleanor Roosevelt sought her advice on questions of children's welfare. When Harry Truman won the presidency in 1948, she received an invitation to the inauguration. Newspaper profiles described the Memphis Society as a model and its executive as the foremost authority on the placement of children in the United States. Couples wrote from across the country asking for one of her babies, sometimes specifying hair color and sex as if completing an order form, and the office obliged, because that was in fact what the office did. At home, her life had a shape the public never examined. She shared her house with Anne Atwood Hollinsworth, the younger woman who had come with her from Mississippi and worked beside her for decades. In August of 1943, in Dyer County, Tennessee, Tann legally adopted her adult companion. It sounds strange to modern ears, and it was strange then, but it was a recognized quiet arrangement of the era, a way for two women who could not marry to guarantee that property would pass from one to the other. The record states the fact and stops there, and so will this film. What the arrangement does tell us is that Georgia Tann understood, with complete precision, how adoption law could be bent to private purposes. She had, after all, bent it before. By the end of the 1940s, she was earning a public salary of a few $1,000s a year. She lived in a substantial house, kept a farm property, employed a chauffeur, and drove through Memphis in a Packard and later a Cadillac. Nobody who mattered asked the obvious question, because the obvious question was rude, and because the people positioned to ask it were the same people whose portraits hung in the city's halls of power. Her doctrine had one more feature worth marking, because it explains so much of what the files later showed. If environment was everything, then moving a child from a poor home to a rich one was not an injury. It was a rescue, by definition, every time. The mothers on the losing end of that arithmetic were not victims in this doctrine. They were the environment. Once a mind accepts that premise, there is no theft it cannot describe to itself as philanthropy, and no paper it cannot sign with a steady hand. That was the person. Now for the machinery that made the person untouchable, because a doctrine and a nice car do not move 5,000 children. Courts do. On the 1st of May 1920, 4 years before Georgia Tann arrived in Memphis, a woman named Camille Kelly took the bench of the Shelby County Juvenile Court. She was among the first women in the South to serve as a judge, and she became, in her own way, as celebrated as Tann would be. Reporters loved her. She wore a flower at her shoulder in court, spoke warmly of saving children from the gutter, wrote sentimental books about the little lives that passed before her bench, and gave 3 decades of interviews about mercy. She served until November of 1950. The timing of her departure is not a coincidence, and we will come to it. A juvenile court judge in Tennessee in those decades held a kind of power that is difficult to overstate. There was no jury in her courtroom. There were rarely lawyers. The rules of evidence were loose, the hearings were closed, and the records were confidential by design, on the theory that children deserved privacy. Inside that sealed room, a single signature could declare a mother unfit, terminate her rights, and hand her child to an agency as a ward. There was no meaningful appeal for a woman who could not afford counsel. In practice, whatever Judge Kelly signed became the truth. What the state's own reviewers later concluded was that for years, a pipeline ran between that courtroom and the society's office. It worked in both directions. When Tann's workers identified a child worth taking, a petition could appear before Kelly alleging neglect or unfitness, and custody could move to the society with startling speed. When a mother fought back and demanded her child, her case landed before the same judge who had signed the child away, a judge who considered the society's executive a distinguished colleague and a personal friend. The mothers were, in the fullest sense, arguing with a wall. It is important to say plainly what the record supports about Camille Kelly, and what it does not. The state investigation that eventually examined her conduct found that she had failed destitute families on many occasions, and that she had permitted family ties to be destroyed. It did not find that she took money. No evidence has ever surfaced that Kelly was paid for a single signature, and this film will not suggest otherwise. What the file describes is something that needs no bribe. She believed the doctrine too. A child moved from a shack to a mansion was a child saved, and the woman requesting the transfer was the nation's foremost expert on such salvations. Between two believers, 5,000 transfers do not require a single dishonest dollar. They require only agreement. Still, a courtroom and a charity cannot do this alone in a watched city. The question a careful viewer should be asking by now is where the watchers were. Memphis had newspapers, ministers, welfare officials, and politicians. It had a state government in Nashville, with a licensing power over child-placing agencies. Somebody, in 26 years, must have complained. People did. That is the point. People complained, and it made no difference. And the reason it made no difference had a name. Edward Hull Crump ran Memphis. There is no softer, accurate verb. A former mayor who no longer needed the office, he controlled the city's politics from the 1920s into the 1940s. His organization decided who held every post that mattered, from the police department to the county courts to the delegations Memphis sent to Nashville. His machine delivered votes in extraordinary numbers, and in exchange, the city ran the way he liked it. Orderly, prosperous on the surface, and closed to inconvenient questions. Georgia Tann understood her city. She made herself useful to its rulers and pleasant to its institutions. The society's board was stocked with respectable Memphis names. Its fundraisers drew the right families. Its executive appeared in the papers at the elbow of civic power, and her operation enjoyed the specific, practical protections that mattered. Police and sheriff's deputies enforced the juvenile court's custody orders, which meant that when a mother resisted, the physical power of the state stood with the society and not with her. Complaints filed with city officials went nowhere in particular. In Crump's Memphis, nothing went anywhere in particular unless the machine wanted it to. The protection reached Nashville too. Tennessee's Department of Public Welfare held, on paper, the authority to inspect and license child-placing agencies. For years, welfare workers who looked at the Memphis Society came away disturbed. Reports were written. Concerns were raised about the volume of out-of-state placements and the condition of children in the society's boarding homes. And each time, the matter died quietly, because the Memphis delegation in the legislature was the machine's delegation, and the machine did not care to have its city's most admired charity inspected into scandal. At least one state welfare official who pressed the issue found that pressing it was bad for a career in Tennessee. Set the pieces side by side, and the machine comes into focus. Informants in the maternity wards found the children. The society took them. The juvenile court legalized the taking. The police enforced it. The amended birth certificates erased it. The press celebrated it. The political machine insulated all of it, and the state agency that existed to stop it could not get traffic past the machine's men in Nashville. Every component was a public institution doing a recognizable version of its job. Assembled in this particular order, they formed a conveyor belt that ran from the poorest doorsteps in Memphis to the richest addresses in America, and it ran for a quarter of a century without a single component failing. One question remains before the machinery is complete, and it is the crudest one. Where did the money come from, and where did it go? But money in this trade always traveled inside paperwork, and the paperwork comes first. Belief and protection made the operation possible. Paper made it permanent. And the paper deserves a chapter of its own, because Georgia Tann's most durable talent was never salesmanship, it was drafting. Consider first the courtroom she worked beside. Juvenile proceedings in Tennessee were closed to the public and the press, informal by statute and recorded thinly. A finding of unfitness might rest on a caseworker's verbal report. Notice to a parent might be a formality. In the files that later came open, researchers found terminations of parental rights granted with the parent absent and unrepresented. In some cases, the parent was never properly told the hearing was happening at all. Every one of those orders emerged from the courthouse dressed identically to a just one. That is the property of legal paper that made the whole enterprise possible. A fraudulent order and a righteous order look the same in a filing cabinet. Consider next the birth certificate. The amended certificate, adopted state by state through this era, was genuinely new legal technology, and Tennessee's version served the Memphis operation like a purpose-built tool. Once an adoption was finalized, the state issued a fresh certificate naming the adoptive parents as parents, and sealed the original. The stated purpose was the child's dignity. The operational effect was laundering. A child taken by fraud in Memphis arrived in New York with state-issued papers that contained no trace of the fraud. Any future investigator would have to defeat 2 state seals just to learn the question, let alone the answer. Consider, finally, the legislation itself. Accounts of the scandal, drawing on the research assembled after the records opened, describe Tann's direct influence on Tennessee's adoption statutes across her tenure, through the Memphis delegation, and through her standing as the state's resident expert. The $7 cap constrained her competitors, the licensed and scrupulous agencies, more than it ever constrained an office that billed off the books. Provisions easing out of state placement served her pipeline. Confidentiality provisions served her files. It is a pattern historians of regulation know in other industries and flinch to find here. The leading operator helps write the rules of the trade, and the rules fit the operator like a tailored coat. The paper mill had one more product, and it may be the cruelest in the inventory. False histories. Adoptive families received biographical sketches of their new children, and the files show these were composed, not compiled. Dead mothers described as college-educated. Fathers invented as young professionals killed in accidents. Ages adjusted to make a child more placeable. Because of that last practice, some survivors of this story have never known their real birthdays. Each sketch was written to close a sale, and each one became a person's entire origin, memorized, cherished, and false. When the records opened decades later, adoptees did not simply learn their mother's names. Many learned that every fact they had ever been told about themselves had been composed by a sales office in Memphis. Paper, then, at every station. Paper to take the child. Paper to move the child. Paper to rename the child. Paper to invent the child. And paper, eventually, to seal the rest of the paper. The operation is sometimes described as running on secrecy, and the description is exactly wrong. It ran on documentation. It simply made sure it was the author. Now the money can be followed properly, because now it is clear what the money was buying. Not children alone. Finality. Before this film leaves the machinery for good, the mothers themselves need a chapter in it. The record of resistance is real. It disposes of the laziest myth about this case, the notion that Memphis's poor surrendered their children passively and discovered their grief later. They fought. The files and the later interviews document mothers who returned to Poplar Avenue day after day and were turned away by staff, instructed to describe them as disturbed. Mothers who saved coins for a lawyer found that no Memphis lawyer with a future would take a case against the society. A case against the society was a case against the court it served, and against the machine above the court. Mothers who wrote to Nashville, to the welfare department, to the governor's office, letters that survive in state files with their careful grammar and their enclosed photographs, asking whether the state of Tennessee knew where their children were. The state's replies, where replies exist, are form letters. The matter has been reviewed. The placement was lawful. No further information is available. A few pressed all the way to a courtroom, and the courtroom cases show the trap at its cleanest. The proceeding would land before the juvenile court that had signed the original order, or before judges disinclined to overturn a colleague, and the society arrived with files, certificates, and findings, while the mother arrived with her own word. The paper always won. Researchers who later worked through the opened records found case after case in which every document was procedurally correct and the entire stack was substantively false, and a 1930s courtroom had no instrument for telling the difference. Neither, it should be said, did a 1930s newspaper. Reporters heard these stories for years. Against them stood the word of the city's most decorated charity, its beloved lady judge, and the plain fact that grieving poor women make unreliable witnesses in the eyes of comfortable institutions. Editors passed. The stories stayed in kitchens. What the resistance bought, in the end, was the record itself. Every unanswered letter in a state file, every docket entry, every saved receipt from a lawyer who quit, became, decades later, corroboration. When the investigation finally came, it did not have to establish that mothers had objected all along. The mothers had been building that proof, alone and at their own expense, for 26 years. The file that convicted the system was, in meaningful part, written by the women the system had defeated, one certified letter at a time. History should record that they were not passive. History should record that they were outgunned. The war years pushed the operation to its documented peak, and the mechanism of the surge is worth a moment, because it shows the enterprise responding to history the way a business responds to a boom. The war rearranged exactly the households the net was built to catch. fathers shipped out, and some did not come back, and some came back to marriages the war had ended in every way but paperwork. Mothers followed war work into the cities, into boarding houses and double shifts, raising children between factory whistles, in a country that had built no childcare to speak of. Wartime romances produced babies on timelines the era refused to forgive, and the maternity wards filled with precisely the patients the informants were paid to notice. Every strain the war placed on a poor family arrived in the files of the society as what its paperwork liked to call neglect. Demand rose in step. The same war that broke the supply-side households sent the buying side into the agencies in numbers. These were prosperous couples who had deferred family through the Depression. Amid the national ache for home and children, they would defer it no longer. The waiting lists at scrupulous agencies stretched toward the horizon, and Memphis, which had no waiting list money could not shorten, entered its best years. The 1,200 placements the investigation counted from 1944 onward are the boom in a single number. It was in these same overcrowded years that the boarding homes filled past any pretense of care. The dysentery came. The ledger at Elmwood grew. Boom and mortality were not separate stories. They were the same story, told in the two currencies the operation dealt in. The war contributed one last thing: cover. A country absorbed in casualty lists does not audit its charities, and a city proud of its war effort had less appetite than ever for stories that shamed it. The society sold family in wartime America, the least questionable product in the national imagination, and the years when its rooms were fullest and its losses were worst were also, by every account, the years when its public standing stood highest. 1945, the year the fever ran through the cribs, was also a year the Christmas babies smiled from the holiday pages as usual. Both of those facts came out of the same house. The city saw one of them. In December, in the late 1940s, readers of the Memphis Press Scimitar could open their afternoon paper and find photographs of babies. Each photograph carried a caption, written in the cheerful voice of a department store advertisement. "Yours for the asking. They'd like to be your Christmas gift." The children were real. The offer was real. The Christmas feature had run for years and had become a beloved local tradition, and families wrote in to claim the children the way families wrote in about puppies. Contemporary accounts describe the society moving 25 and 30 children through the holiday promotion in a single season, and later reporting described raffle-style giveaways in which a ticket cost $25. It is worth pausing on how this looked to the people of Memphis, because nobody hid it. That is the fact that separates this story from a conspiracy. The advertisements ran under the society's Respectable name in a major newspaper. The mayor's city licensed it. The public read it over coffee and found it heartwarming. An institution does not advertise a crime. It advertises a service, and by the 1940s, the Tennessee Children's Home Society operated the most efficient service of its kind in the United States. The efficient part traveled by rail and by air. Healthy white infants, the inventory the market prized most, were matched to out-of-state applicants through correspondence that read like retail. Applicants specified sex, coloring, and age. The society supplied descriptions and photographs, invented pedigrees where the truth was inconvenient, and arranged delivery. Paid escorts, often nurses, carried infants on overnight trains to New York and on flights to Los Angeles, sometimes several at a time. State investigators later followed the arithmetic of one such worker's repeated trips west and documented the pattern in detail. Children left Tennessee in batches. Money came back. Hollywood was the showroom that gave the operation its glamour. Joan Crawford adopted twin girls, Kathy and Cynthia, through the Memphis Society. June Allison and her husband Dick Powell adopted through it as well. There is no evidence that these families knew anything was wrong, and this film does not claim otherwise. That is precisely what made the celebrity clientele so valuable. Photographs of a famous actress with a beautiful adopted baby were the best advertising a baby seller could ever buy, and they cost her nothing. Wealthy and famous applicants moved to the front of the line, and their names quietly moved through the society's correspondence as references for the next wave of buyers. New York deserves a special mention, because New York shows the legal engineering at its cleanest. Tennessee law at least required a pretense of process. But a Tennessee agency placing a child across state lines could exploit the gap between two states' laws, and the society did, industrially. Of the roughly 1,200 children the society placed in its final 6 years, the great majority left Tennessee. The buyers were far away. The courts that approved the adoptions were far away. And the mothers were in Memphis, holding papers that said nothing true. Every piece of this floor plan, the catalog copy, the escorts, the celebrity showroom, the interstate routing, existed for one reason. It kept the supply side and the demand side of the business from ever meeting. A mother in a Memphis boarding house and a banker's wife on Park Avenue were connected by nothing but a gray-haired woman's office, and the office wrote all the paperwork both of them would ever see. Before the ledger closes, the demand side of it deserves one honest look, because 5,000 placements require 5,000 sets of adoptive parents, and history is not served by imagining them as villains. The files, and the interviews given by adoptive families in the decades since, mostly describe something more uncomfortable than villainy. They describe customers of a respectable business who had every incentive not to examine it. Picture the couple the era produced in numbers. Married in the 30s or during the war, prosperous, childless after years of trying, in a culture where childlessness was quietly read as failure. Legitimate agencies offered them waiting lists measured in years and intrusive scrutiny of their homes and marriages. Then a friend of a friend mentions Memphis. The agency there is famous. Its director lectures nationally and is photographed with movie stars. The fees are steep, but they arrive itemized on letterhead. The paperwork carries court seals and state certificates. A nurse delivers the baby to the airport gate. Nothing about the transaction looks like a back alley. It looks like competence, which is what it was. Some noticed things: the speed, the vagueness about origins, the way questions about the mother were met with polished sadness and a change of subject. A few, to their credit, withdrew. Most did not. And this film declines to flatter its audience by pretending the choice was hard to understand. They wanted a child. An esteemed institution said yes. The entire moral hazard of the operation lived in that yes. And Georgia Tann understood her customers as well as she understood her suppliers. Both were people in need. Both were told a story built precisely to end their questions. The mothers were told the child was gone. The buyers were told the child was theirs. Only the office knew both stories at once, which is another way of saying only the office ever knew the truth. There is a late chapter of national history that vindicates the buyer's innocence in the aggregate, and it belongs here. In 1955, the United States Senate turned its attention to the interstate traffic in infants, in hearings led by the same Estes Kefauver whose election had helped break the Memphis machine. The subcommittee documented a national black market in babies operating across state lines, with prices and methods that read like the Memphis Files. It found the market thriving 5 years after Georgia Tann was in her grave. Memphis was not an aberration the country had corrected. It was the largest documented franchise of a trade the country had not yet decided to stop. Federal law regulating interstate placement remained weak for decades afterward, and adoption fraud persisted at scales smaller but structurally identical. The buyers of 1945 could not have known they stood inside the most efficient node of a national market. The Senate itself only mapped the market once its most famous operator was dead. Which brings the story to the numbers themselves, and the numbers are the confession. $7. It has come up before in this film, and here is its full meaning. Under Tennessee law, $7 was the maximum an agency could charge for handling an adoption. The figure existed precisely so that no one could make a business of placing children. It was a fee for filing, nothing more. Every dollar above 7 was, in the plain intent of the law, not supposed to exist. Now, the other column. Out-of-state applicants paid the society's executive what the market would bear, and the market for healthy white infants in the 1940s bore a great deal. Several $100s was routine. The best documented placements ran to figures like $750. And at the top of the market, wealthy applicants paid amounts that reached toward $5,000 once the invented charges were totaled. The invoices were works of fiction in themselves. Transportation fees far beyond any train fare. Boarding charges for weeks the child had not been boarded. Legal fees for lawyers who had done nothing. A New York or California family told these were the necessary costs of a Tennessee adoption, paid without question. Asking questions felt ungrateful. The state's investigator later established where much of the money went, and it is one of the flattest facts in the file. Checks were made out not to the Tennessee Children's Home Society, but to Georgia Tann personally. Her recorded salary was modest. Her houses, her farm, her chauffeur, and her cars were not. The investigation ultimately described the enterprise in the governor's blunt phrase as a black market in babies worth a reported $1 million, a sum, in 1950 money, worth well over $10 million today. However the total is counted, the structure of it is not in dispute. The profit had one direction and one beneficiary, and the beneficiary had run the books herself for 26 years. Sit with the two columns for a moment, because together they answer a question this film raised at the start. $7 was the law. $5,000 was the practice. An institution does not drift by accident across a gap of that width. Every invented invoice was typed by someone. Every amended certificate was signed by someone. Every escort's ticket was purchased by someone. The gap between 7 and 5,000 was crossed on purpose, in paperwork, thousands of times. And yet money is not the darkest ledger in this story. The children who could be sold were, in the terrible bookkeeping of that office, the fortunate ones. The next part of the record concerns the children who could not be sold and what the house on Poplar Avenue held for them. Everything in this film so far has been, in the coldest sense, a business story, a supplier, a market, prices, and protection. If the record stopped there, Georgia Tann would stand in history as a profiteer who corrupted adoption, and the story would be ugly enough. The record does not stop there. This is the point where the story changes what it is about, and it changes in a boarding house. The Society's public receiving home on Poplar Avenue was the address on the letterhead. The operation's real holding capacity was scattered across Memphis in houses the public never saw. Children waiting for placement, or unsuitable for placement, were kept in boarding homes run by paid keepers and in the society's own crowded upstairs rooms. What conditions prevailed inside them entered the record from multiple directions over the years, through welfare workers' observations, through the memories of survivors who grew old enough to testify, and finally through the state's investigation. The descriptions agree: crowded rooms, summer heat under a Tennessee roof with no relief, too few caretakers for too many infants, illness moving from crib to crib, the way illness moves through any crowded place, care that was, at its best, custodial, and at its documented worst, appalling. Some of what survivors described belongs to the category of deliberate cruelty. Children punished harshly for crying, for wetting, for the ordinary failures of frightened small children. Children tied or restrained. Children who learned that the safest thing a child in those rooms could be was silent. This film will not linger in that room, beyond the saying of it, because the point is not spectacle. The point is what the conditions did to the operation's own arithmetic, and the arithmetic is this: infants in crowded, understaffed, unsanitary boarding conditions die at rates that hospitals had understood since the previous century. The society's holding system concentrated the youngest and most fragile children in exactly those conditions. It did so while avoiding the oversight that might have forced improvements, because oversight was the one thing the enterprise could not afford. The consequence arrived on schedule, year after year. Children sickened in the society's care, and a number that no one can now fix with certainty died in it. The worst documented stretch came in 1945. That year, a dysentery outbreak moved through the society's children. Dysentery is a disease of contaminated conditions, and in an infant, it kills by dehydration, quickly and miserably. In roughly 4 months, by the accounts assembled afterward, somewhere between 40 and 50 of the society's children died in the outbreak. 40 to 50, in one season, in one city, in the custody of the most celebrated child-placing agency in America. For comparison, an orphanage of that era, operating with ordinary diligence, might lose a small number of children in a bad year, and face hard questions about each one. No hard questions. Followed 1945. The society answered to no. Inspector Memphis would send. Across the full 26 years, later investigators and researchers put the deaths in the society's custody as high as 500 children. The figure is an estimate, and this film will treat it as one. The records that would settle it were kept by the same office that had every reason to keep them badly. Some children entered the system with their names already altered. Some deaths may therefore sit in the files, under identities that match no missing child anywhere. That is not a detail. That is the design of the system doing in death exactly what it did in life, making children untraceable. During the same era, reporting and later research noted something the numbers implied. Memphis and Shelby County recorded infant mortality among the worst in the nation in those years, and accounts of the scandal have attributed a share of that standing to the society's losses. The claim originates in the reporting and research around the case rather than in a court finding, and it should be carried carefully. What can be said flatly is smaller and worse. A single private office in one American city held enough dying infants for enough years that historians argue about its effect on the mortality statistics of an entire county. Here is the reframe, stated once and plainly. The question this story began with was how a charity became a market. The question the record forces from this point forward is different. It is not about where the children went. It is about how many never went anywhere at all. A market at least wants its inventory alive. What the file describes is an operation that took in far more children than it could sell or keep safe, and absorbed the deaths as overhead. The mothers of Memphis were told their children had gone to better lives, and some had. Some were in Beverly Hills learning to swim. Some were under the boarding house behind a keeper's fence, and 19 of them lay in a small plot of ground at Elmwood Cemetery that the society had bought quietly, early, and for exactly this purpose. That plot has been waiting in this story since the beginning. It is time to go there. Elmwood is the old cemetery of Memphis, 80 acres of magnolias and obelisks south of downtown, where the city has buried its generals, its mayors, its yellow fever dead, and its ordinary families since before the Civil War. Respectable Memphis lies at Elmwood. It is exactly where a respectable children's charity would hold a burial lot, and the Tennessee Children's Home Society did. The society's lot is 14 feet by 13, a little smaller than a parking space and a half. In it lie 19 children. The first of them was buried on September 17, 1923. Hold that date against the official story for a moment. Georgia Tann took over the Memphis operation in 1924. The lot was purchased, and receiving children before her tenure formally began, in the period when she was already working her way into Memphis child placing, while the Mississippi Society was concluding she could not be trusted with children. The ground, in other words, was prepared early. Whatever else changed in 1924, the arithmetic of dead children did not begin with her arrival on the letterhead, and it did not trouble the society at any point afterward. For decades, the 19 lay without headstones. The cemetery's own ledgers recorded them the way the society reported them, and the way the society reported them is its own small window into the operation. First names only. Baby Estelle, Baby Joseph, a first name and a date, and nothing else. In the burial records of children who had, every one of them, been born with full names to real mothers somewhere in Tennessee. The society knew those names. The society was the reason the ledger did not. 19 is not 500, and the gap between those numbers is part of the record too. The Elmwood lot held the deaths the society processed formally, with an undertaker and a plot and an entry in a ledger. The investigations and survivor accounts describe other endings handled with less ceremony, burials on the grounds behind boarding homes, cremations, deaths that produced no paper at all. How many children lie in ground no one has ever marked is one of the questions the sealed records never answered, and now likely never will. The 19 at Elmwood are not the toll. They are the toll's visible edge, the part that happened to pass through an institution honest enough to keep a ledger. The lot stayed bare until the era when this story finally surfaced, and what happened then belongs to the last act of this film. For now, one image is enough to carry forward. Through all the years the Christmas advertisements ran, through the escorts' flights to Los Angeles and the checks made out to one woman's name, the society maintained a small, crowded piece of ground in the city's finest cemetery. It was filled with the society's own first-named children. The office knew the address. The office had paid for it. Before the investigation is allowed to close this act, the record has one more population to account for, the place children themselves, in the years after the escorts handed them over. The files could follow a child to a doorstep. What happened behind the doorstep entered the record only later, from the survivors, and the range of it needs stating, because the operation's defenders, then and since, have leaned on a comfortable assumption. The children, whatever the method, ended up in fine homes. Some did. The assumption, as a general claim, does not survive the testimony. The operation performed no meaningful investigation of its out-of-state buyers. That is not an inference. It is visible in the speed of the placements and confirmed by the survivors' histories. A home study that exists to close a sale examines nothing, and so the children were distributed across the full range of what money can contain. Many landed with couples who wanted a child with their whole hearts and raised the one they received with devotion, and those adoptees speak of good childhoods shadowed only, and not lightly, by the later discovery of how they had been obtained. Others landed in houses where money had purchased a child the way it purchases an ornament, for the completion of a picture, and the testimony from those houses describes coldness, servitude, and worse. Children worked like hired hands on properties they would never inherit. Children reminded, when they displeased, what they had cost. And some were sent back. The operation accepted returns. A child who proved sickly, or difficult, or insufficiently blonde as infancy, gave way to childhood, could be exchanged. The files and survivor accounts document children who made the journey to a buyer and then made it again to a second. The office rewrote the paperwork each time. What a return did to the child being returned is not recorded in any invoice, and the survivors who lived it have described it in interviews with a flatness that is its own kind of testimony. They had learned exactly what they were in the transaction, at an age when other children were learning their letters. The point of this accounting is not that adoption placed children in bad homes at some special rate. Lawful agencies of the same era, checking homes with real diligence, placed children who nonetheless suffered, because childhood is not insurable. The point is narrower and harder. Every safeguard that lawful agencies maintained, and this operation abolished, existed to catch precisely the outcomes described above, and the operation abolished them because safeguards slowed sales. Whatever happened to a child after the airport gate, good or terrible, happened unwatched, by design. The office had promised 5,000 mothers that their children were going to better lives. At the moment of each promise, it had no idea whether that was true, and no mechanism for finding out. Between the closing of the society and the opening of its files lies a generation of testimony this film has drawn on quietly throughout. Before the story reaches September of 1950, that testimony should stand in the record under its own name. The children of the operation did not stay children. They grew up, and after 1995, they could finally check their memories against the paper, and the two matched. They remembered the boarding homes, rooms of cribs, the smell, the crying, and the specific silence of infants who have learned that crying brings nothing. They remembered being coached before visits from prospective parents, dressed and warned, taught to smile, and to say nothing about the rooms. They remembered siblings through a doorway, and then not. Some remembered their own names, carried privately for decades under the names the paperwork assigned them, like a coin sewn into a coat lining. One survivor after another has described the same instruction delivered in the same institutional voice. Forget. You are a lucky child now. Be grateful. Gratitude is the word that recurs, and it deserves a moment, because the operation weaponized it twice. The children owed gratitude to the families who received them, which foreclosed their questions. The families owed gratitude to the agency that had delivered them, which foreclosed theirs. An enterprise built on taking managed to leave nearly everyone it touched feeling indebted to it. Survivors interviewed in their 60s and 70s still pause before criticizing the woman in the files, still reflexively soften it, still say she may have meant some good. The conditioning outlived the conditioner by half a century. That, as much as any invoice, is the measure of what was done. and they remembered small mercies, and the interviews returned to them as often as to the cruelties. Survivors have described keepers who showed the sick ones gentleness the operation never required of them, escorts who treated a frightened child as a child rather than cargo, adoptive parents who saved every scrap of the paperwork because they sensed their child might one day need even lies to work backward from. The file is a catalog of institutional failure, but the testimony stitches it through with individual people doing what little the structure allowed. None of it slowed the structure. All of it mattered to a particular child on a particular night, and survivor after survivor names such moments as the thing that kept them whole. The operation, the court, the machine, the market, the ground, and the witnesses. By the summer of 1950, every piece of what this film has described stood intact and running. Its architect was 58 years old and a national authority. No force visible anywhere in Tennessee had ever slowed her by a single child. What broke it, when it finally broke, was an election. Numbers have carried much of this film, and before its final act, the numbers themselves should be put on the stand, because a viewer is owed an account of where they come from and how far they can be trusted. Begin with what is counted directly. About 1,200 children, placed out in the final 6 years, 1944 through 1950, the period for which the investigation reconstructed the files most completely. That figure is as close to hard as this case gets. Project it backward across a tenure that ran from 1924. Adjust for the operation's slower early years and its wartime acceleration, and the estimate that responsible researchers reach lands near 5,000 children in total. It is an estimate, built from placement rates, correspondence volume, and the files that survived, and it carries the uncertainty any projection carries. It also carries a direction. The files that would raise the count were the kind the office had reason not to keep. Few students of this case believe 5,000 is generous. The number is spoken as a ceiling by no one. Now translate it into felt terms, because a total that large stops meaning anything. 5,000 children across 26 years is roughly 190 a year. That is nearly 4 children a week, every week, for a generation. A schoolroom of children a month, moved through one office, year over year, in a city that noticed nothing. Set the deaths beside it. 500, as an upper documented estimate, is 1 child in 10 who entered that pipeline and never left it alive. Any hospital, any orphanage, any inspector of the era would have recognized that rate instantly as catastrophe, if any inspector had been permitted to compute it. And mark, finally, the number that is missing. There is no reliable count of the mothers. 5,000 children did not come from 5,000 separate families, sibling groups being what they were, but the families numbered in the thousands, and no agency, then or since, has ever assembled them into a total. The children were at least inventory, and inventory gets counted. The mothers were the discard pile of the operation, and the record treats them accordingly. Most of what history knows about them, it knows because some of them refuse to stay discarded, and their letters are the count we have. The Crump machine did not fall to a scandal. It fell to arithmetic of its own. In the elections of 1948, Tennessee voters broke the machine's grip on statewide office. Estes Kefauver took a Senate seat over Crump's fierce opposition, and Gordon Browning, an old and open enemy of the Memphis machine, returned to the governor's chair. The men who had absorbed complaints about Memphis institutions for 2 decades were suddenly out of power in Nashville, and the men newly in power owed Memphis nothing. It took 2 more years for that political fact to reach a certain office on Poplar Avenue. When it came all at once. Through the summer of 1950, state welfare officials, no longer blocked from above, assembled what they knew: the volume of out-of-state placements, the money that did not match any lawful fee schedule, the condition of the society's wards. What they carried to the governor was enough. On September 11th, 1950, Gordon Browning stood before reporters in Nashville and said the quiet part in public, in words the Memphis Commercial Appeal printed for the city, to read over breakfast. The state was investigating a reported $1 million black market in babies, run through the Memphis branch of the Tennessee Children's Home Society. He appointed a Memphis attorney named Robert Taylor as special investigator, with instructions to follow the operation wherever the paper led. For 26 years, no sentence like that had ever been said aloud by anyone with power in Tennessee. The reaction in Memphis was a compound of shock and recognition. Shock from the public, which knew the society through Christmas features and celebrity photographs. Recognition from the mothers, hundreds of them, who had spent years being told by every official in reach that what they knew had happened to them had not happened. For the first time, the state of Tennessee was saying, in a governor's voice, that it had. Taylor's men went to work fast. What they found confirmed the shape of everything this film has described. Files that documented placements by the hundred, with the fees running to one woman's benefit. Correspondence with out-of-state applicants that read as commerce. The whole examinable skeleton of a market. What the investigators did not find was the woman herself, behind her desk, available for questions. Georgia Tann was dying. She had been diagnosed with cancer of the uterus, and by that September, the disease was in its last weeks. As the investigation opened, she lay in her house in Memphis, attended and out of reach. There would be no interview, no interrogation, no moment under oath. On September 15th, 1950, 4 days after the governor's announcement, she died at home. She was 59 years old. 3 days after her death, the state moved formally against the society, and events came quickly then, in the way they do when a dam has already failed. The Memphis branch was shut down. Its charter arrangements were unwound, and the remaining wards passed into other hands. In November, after the first findings reached the public, Judge Camille Kelly announced her retirement from the juvenile court bench she had held for 30 years, and left it under a cloud of published charges she never answered in any courtroom. The society that had been a national model in August did not exist by the end of the year. Notice what is missing from that sequence: an arrest. There is none anywhere. The only person the state had named was dead, beyond every jurisdiction but history's, and with her death, the question of criminal responsibility lost its defendant. The investigation continued, because the governor had ordered a full accounting, but an accounting was now the most it could ever be. The story's villain had left the stage at the precise moment the audience was finally allowed to look at her, and the timing, though no one planned it, would shape everything that came after. There would be a report. There would never be a trial. The 1950 headlines set off one more panic, the record preserves, and it ran in the opposite direction from every other grief in this story. Across the country, in the fine houses, adoptive parents read the words "black market" beside the name of the agency that had delivered their children, and were afraid. Letters poured toward Tennessee, from families asking the question the mothers of Memphis had been asking for decades, though it was the same question turned inside out. Is this child mine? Lawyers were consulted in New York and California about whether adoptions could be undone, whether birth mothers could come knocking, whether the children could be taken back the way they had been taken. Officials moved quickly to calm them, and the calming itself became policy. The adoptions would stand. Whatever the origins, the placements were final. It was the correct answer for the children, very likely. And it was also, notice, the exact outcome the operation had engineered from the first amended certificate. Finality had been the product all along. In the crisis, the state confirmed the warranty. The mothers of Memphis read the same headlines standing in a different world. For them, the governor's announcement was the first official sentence in 26 years that agreed with their memories. The record shows them surfacing within days, at the society's doors, at the newspapers, at the courthouse, carrying their photographs and their saved paperwork. What they wanted was simple and never came. The state's energies went to the accounting, to the estate, and to reassuring the buyers, and no mechanism was ever created, then or later, to search the files on behalf of a mother and tell her where her child had gone. The investigation confirmed the mothers had been robbed, in public, with the state's own seal on the instruments. It offered them the confirmation and nothing else. Several would still be writing letters to Nashville when the archives sealed over their cases like water. What the report said, and what Tennessee did with it, is the true verdict of this case, and it deserves a chapter of its own. Robert Taylor delivered his findings to Governor Browning in 1951. The report ran to hundreds of pages, and together with the Welfare Department's parallel review, it forms the closest thing to a judgment this case would ever receive. It has never been contradicted in its essentials. It is worth hearing plainly in the order of its weight. First, the scale. The Society's Memphis branch had, over roughly a quarter century, taken in and placed out children in numbers that dwarfed any lawful agency of its size. In its final 6 years alone, from 1944 to 1950, about 1,200 children had been adopted out of the home, and Taylor later stated the blunt geography of it. Only a few of them had remained with Tennessee families. The rest had gone out of state, where the fees were unregulated and the courts asked nothing. Projected across the full tenure, drawing on the files and the placement rates, investigators and later researchers arrived at the estimate this film has used throughout, on the order of 5,000 children moved through the operation since 1924. Second, the money. The report confirmed what the canceled checks had already said. Payments from adoptive families had been made to Georgia Tann personally, in violation of the $7 statutory limit, over years, in a volume the governor's office had summarized as $1 million market. The state pursued what it could, filing against her estate to recover the proceeds of the enterprise. The estate was worth a fraction of what had passed through her hands, and after the lawyers and the settlements, the state of Tennessee recovered from the author of the scheme a sum that history records as modest. The money, like the children, had mostly gone somewhere it was never coming back from. Third, the court. The Welfare Department's review of Judge Kelly's conduct reached the findings this film reported earlier, and they bear repeating in the report's own austere spirit. She had failed destitute families on many occasions. She had permitted family ties to be destroyed. She had not personally profited. On the strength of those findings, Tennessee took the following action against the woman whose signature had legalized a generation of seizures. None. She had resigned. She was elderly and distinguished and locally beloved, and the appetite for prosecuting a lady judge who had taken no money did not exist. Camille Kelly died 5 years later, uncharged, with her books about saving children still on the library shelves of Memphis. Fourth, the accomplices in the plural sense. The boarding home keepers, the spotters, the escorts, the workers who had typed the invented invoices. The report described the system they composed. The state charged none of them. Some had acted under orders, some were minor, some were dead, and the defendant who would have connected them all was gone. There was, prosecutors concluded, no case left standing to bring. And fifth, the children themselves, which is where the report runs out of jurisdiction and the story runs out of comfort. Thousands of adoptions built on fraudulent findings and invented papers were now legal facts in dozens of states. Reversing them would have meant taking children, some now grown, from the only families they remembered, on behalf of mothers many of them had been taught were dead or worthless. No court in America was going to do it, and no court did. The adoption stood. Every single one. The fraud was documented, and the fraud was permanent. And those two sentences sat beside each other in Tennessee's official record, without any third sentence to resolve them. That was the verdict. No trial, no conviction, no reversal, one resignation, and a partial recovery of funds from a dead woman's estate. If the story feels unfinished at this point, that is not a flaw in the telling. It is the record itself. The state of Tennessee looked directly at the largest documented child-selling operation in American history, wrote down what it saw, and then did the one thing that would keep the story unfinished for another 2 generations. There is a codicil to the September story, and it concerns the money and the household, because the state's pursuit of the estate opened a window onto how the enterprise ended at home. Georgia Tann died a woman of property. The house in Memphis, the farm outside the city, the automobiles, the investments accumulated across a career whose lawful salary would not have paid for the cars alone. Under the adoption she had executed in 1943, her adult companion, Anne Atwood Hollinsworth, stood as her legal heir. The arrangement had been designed to move property quietly between the 2 women. Now it met a claimant the drafters had never imagined, the state of Tennessee, suing the estate to recover the proceeds of the enterprise. The litigation ground on after the headlines faded, and it ended the way such suits end, in compromise. The state recovered a settlement history records as modest against the scale of the trade. The rest of the money went where money goes, into property, probate, and time, and no accounting ever performed has closed the gap between what the operation charged its customers and what anyone ever found. The society's own end had a bookkeeping of its own. Its remaining wards passed to state supervision. Its records, the intake files, the correspondence, the invoices, the photographs, passed into official custody, which is the only reason this film exists, and the boarding homes emptied on whatever schedule bureaucracy allowed. Memphis absorbed the scandal with the mixed spirit the record preserves. There was genuine civic shock, and there was the quieter species of discomfort belonging to a city that had read the Christmas advertisements for 20 years and now preferred not to discuss what it had found heartwarming. The name Georgia Tann left the papers within a few years. The name did not leave the kitchens on either side of the transaction, and it never has. It locked the file. The press deserves its own reckoning in this story, because journalism appears twice in the file, on both sides of the ledger, and the 2 appearances explain each other. For a quarter century, the Memphis papers were part of the machinery in the plainest sense. The Christmas features were journalism. The admiring profiles were journalism. The society's fundraising appeals ran beside news copy, and its executive was a reliable, quotable civic personage of exactly the kind local pages are built around. None of this required corruption. It required only the ordinary gravity of a one-party town, where the institutions validate each other and a reporter's skepticism has nowhere to be published. The mother's stories, as this film has said, reached newsrooms and died there, not because editors knew them to be true and suppressed them, but because believing them was expensive and disbelieving them was free. Then September of 1950 arrived, and the same gravity reversed. Once a governor said black market into a microphone, the story was protected from above, and the Memphis press turned and covered it hard. The commercial appeal and the press scimitar put the investigation on their front pages day after day, printed the findings as they surfaced, and carried the phrase that has framed the case ever since. The wire services lifted it national. For a season, the Memphis baby market ran in papers from coast to coast, usually beside a photograph of a heavy-set woman in rimless glasses. Most of the country was seeing her for the first time. And then it faded, and the fading is instructive. A scandal without a trial has no second act. There were no charges to follow, no defendant to photograph on courthouse steps, no verdict to await. Editors moved on because the story, as news is structured, had ended, and the sealing law of 1951 guaranteed that no reporter could reopen it with documents. The case fell out of the national press within a couple of years and stayed out for a generation, surviving in occasional retrospectives and in the memories of the families. Journalism had missed the story for 26 years, covered it brilliantly for one, and then lost it again for 40. And at every stage, the determining factor was the same: not what was true, but what was reachable. It is a pattern worth carrying beyond this film, because it is not a Memphis pattern. It is how stories with sealed evidence behave everywhere, and it is why archives and the laws that open them decide what a country gets to remember. In 1951, in the aftermath of the investigation, Tennessee enacted a new adoption law, and inside it sat a provision whose consequences would outlast everyone involved in the scandal. Adoption records in Tennessee were sealed, closed to the adopted, closed to the mothers, closed to researchers and reporters, closed to everyone but the state itself. The statute drew its line in time with bureaucratic precision. Records of adoptions finalized before March 16, 1951, went under seal along with everything after, and with them went the files of the Tennessee Children's Home Society. The paper trail of the largest documented child-selling operation in American history was now, by law, invisible. The official logic was the logic of the era, and it was not entirely cynical. Sealed records, the argument ran, protected adopted children from the stigma of illegitimacy, protected adoptive families from interference, and protected birth mothers from exposure. Every state in the country was moving the same direction in those years, and Tennessee could point to respectable national opinion as it turned the key. But hold the timing up to the light. The state had just finished documenting that thousands of its adoption files were instruments of fraud, and its response, within months, was to make those exact files permanently unreadable. Whatever the intent, the effect is not in dispute. The evidence was not destroyed. It was entombed, which for every practical purpose amounted to the same thing, with one difference that would matter 44 years later. Entombed things can be dug up. Consider what the seal meant on the ground, one life at a time. A woman whose son was taken from her porch in 1938 now had the state's own confirmation that children had been stolen in Memphis, printed in every newspaper in Tennessee. What she could not have, ever, under any procedure, was an answer to the only question she cared about: Where is he? The file with his name in it sat in a state archive, sealed by the same government that had just admitted the file might be a lie. Adopted children grew up, read about the scandal, and wondered in private whether the story in the clippings was their story. The law's answer was uniform. The record exists, it may concern you, and no, you may not see it. So the story went underground for a generation, and in the dark, it did what unfinished stories do. It split in two. One version became legend. The baby thief of Memphis surfaced in magazine retrospectives, in a television movie, in whispered family histories across the country, gathering the fog that gathers around any story nobody can check. Decades later, it would become a novel, Before We Were Yours, that sold more than 4 million copies and carried a version of the boarding house into millions of homes as fiction. The legend kept the story alive, and the legend was, in its outline, true. But it was a story with no documents attached, because the documents were locked in Nashville. The other version lived in kitchens. Men and women adopted out of Memphis in the 30s and 40s raised their own children, buried their adoptive parents, and sat at tables with shoeboxes of fragments. A name half remembered from before the new name, a city on an amended certificate, an age that never quite squared with the mirror. Some of them had spent whole childhoods being told to be grateful, and whole adulthoods being told the records were sealed for their own protection. By the 1980s, those people were in their 40s and 50s. Their birth mothers, where they still lived, were old women. Whatever reunion was ever going to be possible was running out of calendar. The seal had one more effect, and it is the one this film most wants on the record. It converted the state's finding into folklore even for its victims. A mother who had been told her baby died could read the 1950 headlines and still not know whether her case was one of them. The seal held her in the exact uncertainty the society had built for her, and it held her there with the full authority of Tennessee law for 4 more decades. The operation had needed silence to run. The state, having caught it, supplied the silence anyway. What finally broke the silence was not a court and not a legislature. It was a television broadcast, an old woman with a memory of a knock at her door, and a volunteer in Memphis who refused to accept that a locked archive was the end of the story. In 1989, the television program Unsolved Mysteries carried a segment on the Memphis scandal into living rooms across America. It told the story this film has told, compressed to minutes, and it showed the face of Georgia Tann. In a house far from Tennessee, a woman in her 60s named Alma Sipple looked at that face and recognized it. She had opened her door to it in 1945. Alma was the mother from the beginning of this film, the sick baby girl, 10 months old, the offered hospital bed, the long black car, the turned-away visits, and the flat announcement that the child had died, delivered without a certificate, without a funeral, without a grave. Alma had carried that death for 44 years, the way the bereaved carry anything, by building a life around the whole. Now a television program was telling her, in effect, that the whole might be man-made. She reached out to the number the coverage pointed toward, and the number belonged to a Memphis organization called Tennessee's Right to Know. Tennessee's Right to Know was largely the work of a Memphis volunteer named Denny Glad, who had spent years doing, without official standing, what the state refused to do, matching fragments. Adoptees wrote to her with half names and amended certificates. Mothers wrote with dates and hospital wards. Glad and her volunteers worked the edges of the sealed system, the scraps of paper that had escaped the archive. Case by case, they reassembled families the law said could not be reassembled. When Alma Sippel's inquiry reached them, the volunteers went looking for a girl taken from a Memphis hospital in 1945. They found her. Irma had not died. She had been placed through the society, renamed and raised in another family, and she was living in Ohio under the name Sandra Kimbrell. She was 45 years old. In 1990, mother and daughter spoke for the first time since the hospital, and the reunion entered the public record through the Los Angeles Times, which told Alma's story under her own name. The announcement of death, the story that had governed half her life, had been exactly what the file always implied it was: a sales technique. Hold both truths of that reunion at once. The record holds both. A mother learned her daughter was alive, and nothing that was taken came back. The 44 years did not come back. The first steps, the school mornings, the wedding, the grandchildren's births, none of it came back. A phone call cannot return a life. It can only return the truth about one, and the truth was what Tennessee had been sitting on since 1951. Every reunion the volunteers assembled carried the same double weight: joy and the exact measure of what the seal had cost. The legend's climb back into public memory can itself be dated, and the dates matter, because each one pushed the state a step closer to opening the file. The 1989 broadcast was the turning point, but it did not stand alone. Reunion stories moved through the daytime television of the early 90s, including siblings separated through Memphis, meeting on air after half a century. In 1993, the case reached primetime drama: Stolen Babies, a television film built on the scandal, put one of America's most beloved performers, Mary Tyler Moore, into the role of Georgia Tann. Audiences accustomed to her warmth watched her play the woman in the good clothes at the door. The performance won an Emmy, and it fixed the case in the national imagination in a way no document had. Each wave brought Tennessee's right to know new letters, and brought Tennessee's legislature new constituents with old questions, and the pressure that produced the 1995 law was built, measurably, of exactly these stories. The volunteers' method deserves recording, because it was the sealed system's mirror image, and it worked. Where the operation had matched children to buyers, the searchers matched fragments to fragments. A first name remembered from before the rename, set against a birth month from an amended certificate. A hospital ward, set against a date. The organization logged inquiries by the 100, and then by the 1,000 as the broadcast spread. Over the years, its case totals mounted into the hundreds of completed reunions. Each one was assembled without access to the very files that would have made the work a morning's task. When the legislature finally took up the question of opening the archive, the volunteers were called on for the plainest kind of testimony. They could document, from their own logbooks, exactly how many elderly mothers had died mid-search in the years the state had spent protecting them. Stories like Alma's, multiplying through the late 80s and early 90s, did what the 1951 report had not. They made the seal itself the scandal. Adoptees organized, legislators listened, and in 1995 the Tennessee General Assembly passed House Bill 406, opening the records of adoptions completed before March 16, 1951, including, by name, the files of the Tennessee Children's Home Society. The next year, a broader law extended access for adult adoptees generally. Adoption industry groups and others fought the opening in the courts for 3 more years, arguing that birth mothers had been promised confidentiality. The litigation ran until September 27, 1999. On that day, the Supreme Court of Tennessee upheld the open records law, and the archive finally, opened. 44 years after the seal, 49 after the governor's press conference. Inside were the files this film has drawn on, the placements and the invoices and the first named burials. And inside, too, were thousands of individual answers, of the kind Alma Sipple had needed a television program and a volunteer to find. For some families, the answers came in time. For many, the mothers or the children, or both, were dead, and the answer went to a graveholder's descendants instead. The record does not say how many reunions the 44 years of sealing prevented. That number belongs on the long list of things the operation made permanently uncountable, and it is the last entry this film will add to the list. The opened archive did not end this story. It changed the story's tense, and the last stretch of the record runs from the reading room in Nashville to the present day. Through the early 2000s, adoptees and birth families worked the opened files, and the files gave up their contents unevenly, the way damaged records do. Some found clean answers, a name, a county, a living sister. Some found the fictions this film has described, sketches of invented parents that matched no census anywhere, and had to grieve the loss of a history that had never existed before they could search for one that had. Volunteers who had fought for the opening spent their retirements helping strangers read the trade's handwriting. The reunions grew quieter as the mother's generation passed, and by the 2010s the searches had largely become children of the taken, looking for cousins descended from the kept. Then the story received two unexpected engines. The first was commercial genetic testing, which did to the operation's remaining secrecy what no legislature had managed. Amended certificates and invented sketches are powerless against a spit tube. Sibling pairs separated in the 1940s have matched in databases in their 80s. The matching continues as this film is released, an automated, ongoing dismantling of the paper mill's last work. The second was a novel. In 2017, Lisa Wingate's Before We Were Yours, built on the documented history of the Memphis operation, became a #1 bestseller and stayed on the lists for years, selling more than 4 million copies. A story sealed by statute in 1951 has become one of the most widely read episodes of American institutional history, and Elmwood Cemetery now receives readers who arrive holding the novel and asking to be shown what was real. What they are shown is the lot. It is worth recording what surrounds it now. The cemetery gives tours that tell the account plainly. The city that once found the Christmas advertisements heartwarming now teaches the case to social work students as a founding cautionary text. And the reforms trace back in a direct, documented line. Modern licensing of agencies, interstate compacts governing the movement of adopted children, the professional suspicion of any placement that moves too fast or bills too vaguely. Each carries this operation in its ancestry, the way fire codes carry particular fires. Survivors have said in interviews that this is the only monument that matters to them, that the rules exist because of what was done to them. The satisfaction in it is real, and it is the coldest kind history offers. Every account of this case eventually collides with the question a viewer has likely been holding for 2 hours. Why? What was Georgia Tann for, in her own mind, through 26 years of doorsteps and invoices? It is the right question, and this film owes an honest answer, which begins with what the record contains and ends earlier than anyone would like. The record supports money, first and plainly. The checks in her own name, the properties, the gap between salary and style. Whatever else the operation was, it was lucrative to its author, continuously, and no account of her that omits the profit survives contact with the file. The record supports power just as plainly. Witnesses across decades describe a woman who dominated rooms, cultivated the strong, crushed subordinates, and arranged her whole professional world so that no decision of consequence was ever made by anyone else. And the record supports the doctrine, sincerely held or usefully worn, no one can now say which. She repeated the creed of rescue in private as well as public, to colleagues, to staff, to the children themselves. People who dealt with her came away divided then, as historians are divided now. Was she a fraud who had found the perfect philanthropy to hide inside, or a believer whose belief had rotted into license? The file supports either reading on alternating pages. What the record does not contain is an interior. She left no diary that has surfaced, no confession, no reflective letters, no deathbed accounting. The investigation that would have put questions to her missed her by 4 days. Her one extended public voice is the publicity voice, warm, false, and useless as evidence. This film has kept a rule from its first minute, that motive is drawn only from documented behavior, and at the boundary of her inner life, the rule requires a full stop. Whether she believed she was saving children is unknowable. What she did to them is documented past argument, and between those two sentences, history has to live, uncomfortably, forever. It is worth saying why the discomfort matters, as the film's last analytical word. The hunger to find the why, to locate the wound or the greed or the madness that explains her, is at bottom a hunger for reassurance, because an explained monster is a caged one. The file refuses the cage. What it shows instead is more useful and less consoling. It shows that the operation never required a monster at all. It required a market, a machine, a court, a doctrine, and a silence, and every one of those was supplied by ordinary institutions, run by ordinary people. Withhold the why. The how was enough. The how is reproducible. That, not the woman, is what the record asks. One irony remains, and it is the largest in the file, and this film has saved it deliberately for the end. The woman this story has documented is credited, by serious historians, with helping to build modern American adoption itself. The credit is real, and it is meant without a trace of honor. When she began in 1924, adoption in America was rare, stigmatized, and legally thin. When she died in 1950, it was a national institution, and the change ran substantially through her hands. She had marketed adoption to the prosperous classes and made it respectable. She had pioneered practices that became standard everywhere, matching children to families, the amended birth certificate, the sealed file, the professional home study, in her office a sales formality, elsewhere a safeguard. The researcher who spent years deepest in these records put the paradox at its sharpest. The person who did more than perhaps any other single American to popularize adoption was running a criminal market in children. The instruments she refined for concealment became, stripped of her purposes, the ordinary furniture of lawful adoption for half a century. That inheritance cuts both ways, and the record supports both edges. Millions of American families exist today inside an institution she helped normalize, and the overwhelming majority of the adoptions in their histories were lawful, loving, and good. That must be said without hedging. And for half a century, adoptees across the country, with no connection to Memphis at all, lived behind sealed original certificates on the model her era wrote into law, arguing with legislatures for the right to know their own beginnings. The national movement that has, state by state, been unsealing those records in recent decades stands in a direct line of descent from the Tennessee fight this film has described. The Memphis operation is gone. The paperwork architecture it helped design is still being dismantled, statute by statute, in the present tense. It establishes the operation. 26 years, one office, an estimated 5,000 children. The great majority moved out of state for money that the law capped at $7, and the invoices ran to thousands. That is documented in the state's own investigation, and no serious historian disputes it. It establishes the enablers, a juvenile court that signed what it was asked to sign, a political machine that absorbed complaints for 2 decades, a welfare department blocked until the machine fell. It establishes the deaths, dozens in a single documented season, hundreds by responsible estimate, 19 of them lying under first names in a plot the society bought before its own official story even begins. And here is where it stops. The record cannot say how many children were taken in total, because the taker wrote the records. It cannot say how many died, because some deaths produced no paper. It cannot say how many mothers went to their graves believing a living child was dead. It cannot fully say why, because the one person who could have answered questions died 4 days after anyone in power finally asked one. A story like this one does not get a confession. It gets a file, and the file is enough to convict a system, even though it was never enough, in any courtroom, to convict a single human being. Nobody was ever charged. It is worth saying one last time, without heat, because the fact carries its own temperature. Not the executive who died, not the judge who resigned, not the machine, which was never the kind of thing that could stand trial. The only sentence ever imposed in this case was imposed on its victims, and it ran 44 years, and it was called confidentiality. What remains now is small and physical, the way the ends of these stories usually are. In 2015, Elmwood Cemetery raised $13,000, most of it in small donations, and set a monument on the 14 by 13 foot lot where the 19 children lie. There are fresh flowers there some weeks. Adoptees leave them, and so do the descendants of mothers who never stopped looking, and so do strangers who read a novel and then went looking for what was real underneath it. The stone stands over children recorded as Baby Estelle and Baby Joseph, and it cannot give them back their last names, because the office that erased those names erased them thoroughly. It can only mark the ground and tell the truth about it, which is more than the state of Tennessee managed for most of a century. Alma Sipple got her phone call. Thousands never did. The difference between those two outcomes was never justice. It was luck, a television schedule, and one volunteer with a filing cabinet. The record gap this film set out to close is closed now, as far as the paper allows. What stands in the gap where a verdict should be is a small stone in Memphis and a shelf of opened files in Nashville. With them stands the oldest lesson in institutional history, purchased here at the highest documented price in the story of American adoption. An institution trusted absolutely, watched by no one, will bill the powerless for its virtue and file the receipts under seal. There is a version of this ending that the format of documentary badly wants, in which the record's opening heals what the operation broke, and honesty requires refusing it one last time. The archive gave back names, not years. When Alma Sipple finally heard her daughter's voice, both women had to build something new from 2 complete lives that had been lived, in full, without each other. Survivors who found their mothers' graves instead of their mothers have described standing at the stone doing arithmetic. They counted the years between the opening of the records and the date cut above the grass. They measured exactly how late the law had been in their particular case. Some found the answer was 4 years. Some found it was 4 months. The seal did not only hide the truth, it rationed it by lifespan, and the rationing is the final cost on the operations ledger, still being paid at gravesides now by people in their 80s. And yet the emotional question this film opened on a doorstep in 1945 does have an answer, and the survivors themselves have given it, consistently, in interview after interview across 3 decades. Asked why the search mattered when nothing could be returned, they do not speak of years or of justice. They speak of the record, of holding a birth certificate with the first name on it, of learning the mother looked for them, that the letters exist, that the grief on the other side was real and lifelong, that they had not been given away but taken. A stolen life cannot be given back. The truth about it can, and the testimony of the people this film is about is that the truth, even 60 years late, even at a graveside, was worth the whole fight. That is not a consolation history offers. It is the one the survivors built themselves, out of opened files, and no one else has standing to grade it. The first burial in the Society's lot was made on September 17, 1923. The records were opened on September 27, 1999. Between those 2 Septembers lie 76 years, 5,000 children, and a silence that took the combined force of a governor, a television program, a legislature, and a state Supreme Court to break. It broke. That is the note this story ends on, because it is the only redemptive fact the file contains, and it is real. Locked archives can be opened, even after 76 years, even in Memphis.